It began with a single phone call. Not a public announcement, not a press release, not even a whisper from the palace corridors. Just one brief, controlled message delivered through an aide whose expression said more than his words ever could. His Majesty requests your presence at Buckingham Palace. Urgent, private, no press. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Prince Harry paused when he heard it. It had been years since such a direct royal order reached him. He wasn't a stranger to palace summonses. He'd grown up with them. But this one felt different. The tone wasn't fatherly. It was official, cold, almost judicial. He asked what it was about. The aide didn't blink. His Majesty will explain in person. There was silence in the Sussex household that night. Meghan paced, phone in hand, texting furiously to friends in Montecito. Harry stared at his reflection, wondering what kind of emergency could break the unspoken truce between him and his father. Was it about their charity? Their Netflix deal? Another scandal in the press? None of those answers seemed to fit the way his stomach twisted. But the truth waiting for him behind the palace gates was something no amount of royal protocol could prepare him for. What if the very foundation of your identity, the name, the bloodline, the heritage you've lived under your entire life, was suddenly called into question? What if the man you called father for nearly 40 years suddenly wanted proof that you were truly his son? That was the weight behind King Charles's words that day. Inside Buckingham Palace, the air was thick with unspoken tension. The corridors, usually humming with staff, felt strangely empty. Even the portraits seemed to watch in silence. When Harry entered, escorted by an aide, Charles was already there, standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking older, paler, and infinitely more burdened than the last time they met. "Harry," he said softly. The tone was neither welcoming nor cold. It was the tone of a man rehearsing a difficult truth. There were no hugs, no smiles, no fatherly warmth. Just two men divided by duty, blood, and now doubt. The first words out of Charles's mouth were not about reconciliation, not about forgiveness, not even about family. "There are matters," he said, "that must be settled once and for all." Harry frowned. "What matters?" Charles hesitated before lifting a small, cream-colored envelope from the desk. The seal bore the mark of the royal physician. "This." Harry stared at it. His mind raced through possibilities, medical results, financial disputes, maybe even something about Archie or Lilibet. But when Charles continued, the ground beneath him seemed to vanish. "It's a DNA test," Charles said. "For you." Harry's pulse stopped for a moment. The words didn't even register at first. Then they hit him all at once. Cold, slicing through him like winter air. "A DNA test," he repeated, half laughing, as though it must have been a dark joke. "You can't be serious." "I am," Charles said quietly. "It has to be done." The silence that followed felt eternal. Why now? Why after all these years? Why after the Queen's passing, after all the public humiliation, after stepping back from royal life? Why now, when Harry had just started to build a new identity in America? Charles looked exhausted. His eyes flickered with something that wasn't anger, but fear. "There have been concerns," he said. "Things resurfacing. People talking. You know the rumors, Harry. They've never gone away." Harry's heart pounded. He did know the rumors. Everyone did. The jokes about his red hair. The whispers about James Hewitt, the former cavalry officer who once captured Princess Diana's heart during her unhappiest years. The tabloids had mocked it for decades, but it was always dismissed as cruel gossip. Now his father was treating it as a matter of royal fact. Harry's voice broke. "Are you saying you believe them?" Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the window, the afternoon light washing his face in shades of gray. "I'm saying I need to be certain," he said finally. "For you. For the crown. For the record. The record. Not the family. Not the son. The record." That word cut deeper than anything. In that moment, Harry realized this wasn't just about him. It was about legacy. About lineage. About the royal institution's obsession with image and continuity. If the bloodline was tainted, if the monarchy's narrative cracked, it wouldn't just be a family scandal. It would be a constitutional crisis. Harry pushed the envelope back across the desk. "If you're asking me to do this, then you've already decided I don't belong." Charles's expression didn't change. "I'm asking you to do what must be done." There was no shouting, no storming out. Just the hollow sound of a door closing as Harry walked away from the only life he'd ever known. But the story didn't end there. Because according to palace insiders, the test wasn't a request, it was already underway. Some claimed the Royal Medical Unit had quietly accessed genetic samples from archived blood tests done during Harry's military service. Others whispered that an anonymous courier had been sent weeks earlier to collect new samples for official confirmation. The implication was clear. King Charles already knew, or feared he knew, the truth before Harry even stepped foot in that room. And as whispers spread through royal circles, the stakes grew darker. Behind the scenes, lawyers began revisiting property titles connected to the Duchy of Cornwall. The royal estate traditionally passed from father to eldest son. That same estate had funded Harry's former residence, his security detail, and even parts of his lifestyle before he broke away. If Harry wasn't Charles's biological heir, did he still have a legal claim to any of it? One aide allegedly overheard a chilling remark during a late-night discussion in Clarence House. If it's proven, we'll have no choice but to reclaim what isn't rightfully his. It wasn't just a DNA test anymore. It was the prelude to confiscation. And through it all, there were the ghosts of the past, the shadow of Diana, the laughter of the press, the memory of a mother who tried to protect her sons from the institution that would later consume them. Imagine being Harry at that moment. Imagine flying across the ocean, walking into your childhood home, and realizing your father is questioning whether you're even part of his bloodline. The cameras weren't there. The press didn't know yet. But in that room, the monarchy trembled on the edge of something it had always feared: truth. For years, royal watchers dismissed the resemblance between Harry and James Hewitt as coincidence. Hewitt himself denied paternity repeatedly, pointing out that his relationship with Diana began after Harry's birth. But now, with a DNA test allegedly in play, denials weren't enough. People wanted proof. Meanwhile, Meghan reportedly urged Harry not to comply. "You owe them nothing," she was said to have told him. "You've already proven who you are by walking away." But for Harry, the issue ran deeper than defiance. It wasn't just about rebelling against the system. It was about knowing where he came from. The palace, of course, maintained silence. No statements, no leaks, at least not officially. But inside, panic was building. Advisors debated how to handle potential fallout if results confirmed the unthinkable. What would happen to succession? Public confidence? The king's credibility? And then came the move no one expected: the quiet freezing of assets linked to Harry's royal inheritance. Properties, trusts, and privileges tied to the duchy began to shift. Letters were sent. Accounts were reviewed. Overnight, Harry's name began disappearing from documents that had carried it for decades. It wasn't punishment, it was preparation. King Charles was playing defense before the truth even broke. Because if the test came back confirming that Prince Harry was not of royal blood, it wouldn't just humiliate the crown. It could legally alter the chain of royal succession and the control of royal estates. The stakes were no longer emotional, they were constitutional. And through the halls of Buckingham, older courtiers whispered the name that had been buried for years: James Hewitt. Once dismissed as a side note in royal gossip, Hewitt suddenly loomed large again, a man tied by rumor to the future of the monarchy. He had lived quietly for years, avoiding interviews, keeping to himself. But now, with the king's sudden order, people wondered, was he the missing piece of a secret that had haunted the palace since Diana's death? Every royal crisis needs a villain. Every secret needs a keeper. And this time, it seemed King Charles feared both were the same person. Outside, cameras still flashed, but no one truly knew what was happening behind those gilded gates. What they saw was a family divided by pride. What they didn't see was a father wrestling with a truth that could destroy everything his crown stood for. Because if the DNA results revealed what so many had whispered for decades, that Prince Harry was not King Charles's biological son, then the monarchy itself would be standing on a lie. The next days were filled with silence. No press appearances, no official engagements. Even Camilla was said to be visibly shaken. "He's not sleeping," one insider confided. "He just stares at the envelope." Some said the king had already opened it. Others claimed he hadn't yet found the courage. Either way, the damage was already done. Harry, furious and heartbroken, returned to California without an answer, but not without consequence. By the time he landed, Reports were circulating that the Crown Estate had quietly moved to review ownership of certain properties tied to the Sussex Trust. To the world, it looked like another royal feud. But behind closed doors, the king's next decision would ignite something far deeper, a royal reckoning. Because what King Charles did next wasn't to reach out. It wasn't to console. It was to confiscate. He ordered immediate legal review of all holdings, residences, and financial benefits previously granted to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. On paper, it was routine. In reality, it was a royal purge. Why would a father move so swiftly against his own son? What did that DNA test really reveal? And what secret from Diana's past was powerful enough to make a king risk his entire legacy? The truth was coming, and it would not be kind. Because as one palace insider whispered late that night, when the results came in, His Majesty didn't shout. He didn't cry. He just said one word: proceed. And from that moment, the life Prince Harry thought he knew began to unravel piece by piece. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What would you do if your father, a king, called you across the ocean, not for love, not for reconciliation, but for judgment? That was the thought burning in Harry's chest as his private jet descended through the gray English sky. The engines hummed softly, but his mind roared. Every mile closer to London felt like stepping deeper into a storm he didn't understand. Meghan had begged him not to go. "You know how they are," she'd whispered. "If they want something from you, it's never good." He'd tried to dismiss her fears, but now, staring out the window at the familiar outline of Windsor beneath the clouds, he wasn't so sure. It had been years since he'd set foot on royal grounds without a security detail of his own. Now, for the first time, he was coming home unarmed, not in the physical sense, but in spirit. The moment he stepped off the plane, a chill struck him. The tarmac was quiet. No photographers, no welcoming staff, just two black cars and a single figure in a dark overcoat waiting near the hangar. "His Majesty awaits," the man said, bowing slightly. No emotion, no small talk. Harry's jaw tightened. So it's really happening. As the car pulled away, London's skyline rolled by like a memory he couldn't touch. Familiar streets, unfamiliar feelings. He thought about his childhood rides with Diana, her laughter, her warmth, and wondered what she'd say if she could see what this family had become. Would she tell him to face the truth? Or to run while he still could? The car stopped before Buckingham Palace. The gates loomed like iron giants, motionless and indifferent. A guard saluted mechanically as they entered. Harry watched the palace windows. Too many lights for this hour, too many eyes. He knew how the palace operated. Nothing here happened by accident. Inside, the air was colder than he remembered. The smell of polished marble and old furniture wrapped around him like a ghost. He was led down the corridor toward the same room where his mother once stood in defiance of a marriage that broke her heart. And there he was, King Charles III, standing by the fire, back turned, as though speaking to someone who wasn't there. "Harry," Charles said without looking. His voice was calm, too calm. "Sir," Harry replied automatically, the old habit slipping out. Charles turned, studying his son like a man examining a portrait he no longer recognized. "You came. You summoned me," Harry said. Charles motioned to the chair. "Sit." The silence stretched. The ticking of the antique clock filled the room, every second dragging like a drop of water. "Do you know why you're here?" Charles finally asked. Harry's laugh was humorless. "I can guess. Then you already know this isn't easy for either of us." "I didn't ask for easy," Harry shot back. "I asked for honest." Charles's eyes flickered, not with anger, but with weariness. "Honesty," he murmured. "Yes, that's precisely why you're here." He walked to the desk and placed a file on the surface. The folder was stamped "Confidential, Royal Household." Harry's stomach knotted. "The Crown's Counsel has advised me," Charles continued, "to resolve a matter that's lingered for far too long. One that, if left unchecked, could damage the integrity of the institution." Harry frowned. "You mean damage you? This isn't about me." "Of course it is," Harry said. "It's always about you." Charles exhaled through his nose. He didn't fight back. Instead, he opened the folder and pulled out a document, sealed with a red ribbon. "It's time we put certain rumors to rest," he said softly. "Once and for all." Harry's chest tightened. "Rumors? About your parentage." There it was. The word that had haunted him his entire life, spoken now like a sentence. "Father." Charles flinched at the word. Don't. The air snapped between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, indifferent to the royal implosion unfolding beside it. Charles's voice broke the silence. This isn't cruelty, Harry. It's necessity. The world will never stop questioning until it's proven. You deserve certainty as much as I do. Harry leaned forward, his voice low. Certainty or control? Charles hesitated, then said, both. There was honesty in that. Brutal, cold honesty. Harry rose from his chair, pacing the room. He'd faced the world's press. He'd faced Taliban fire. But this was the first time he'd felt truly cornered. Do you have any idea what this will do? He asked. To me? To the children? To the memory of Mum? Charles's hand trembled slightly as he poured a glass of water. Your mother's memory deserves truth, he said, even if it hurts. Harry stared at him. Truth? Or your version of it? Charles didn't answer. He didn't need to. The decision had already been made. That's when the door opened quietly, and one of the king's private secretaries stepped in. Your Majesty, it's ready. Charles nodded, his face unreadable. Harry turned sharply. What's ready? The secretary avoided eye contact. The verification team. They're waiting downstairs. The words sank like stones. You brought them here? Harry said. Without my consent. This is not a court of consent, Charles said. It's a matter of royal integrity. Harry's voice rose. You talk about integrity while stabbing your own son in the back. Charles didn't flinch. I talk about duty. That single word, duty, had destroyed everything before. Diana's marriage, his childhood, his trust. It was the crown's favorite excuse for cruelty. Harry turned away, gripping the edge of the table. You think a DNA test will make you feel secure? You think it'll erase everything I've done? Everything I've endured? Charles's reply was barely a whisper. It might help me sleep. For a moment, the prince saw something flicker behind his father's eyes. Not malice, but fear. Fear of truth. Fear of exposure. Fear of the world discovering that even kings bleed from their insecurities. Harry shook his head slowly. You're not doing this for the crown, he said. You're doing it because you've always doubted me. Perhaps, Charles admitted. But doubt is a burden I can no longer carry. The room fell silent again. And then, with a heavy sigh, Charles said, You may go now. The physicians will contact you for formal procedures. Harry didn't move. His voice came out flat. And if I refuse? Charles's expression hardened. Then the refusal will speak for itself. That was it. The line had been drawn. Harry walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and turned. You've lost more than a son today, he said quietly. You've lost whatever trust you had left. But Charles didn't reply. He simply stood there, shoulders squared, a king to the end. But not a father. Outside the room, the palace felt suffocating. The same walls that had once echoed with Diana's laughter now whispered judgment. As Harry passed through the corridor, he caught sight of an old portrait of his mother, her kind eyes, her half-smile, and for the first time, he wondered if she'd seen this coming. Aides followed him silently as he exited, murmuring into earpieces, avoiding his gaze. Somewhere deep inside, he felt something shift, the last thread connecting him to that institution snapping apart. By the time he stepped outside, the rain had started. It was soft at first, then heavier, drenching him as he stood under the portico. No umbrella, no car ready this time. Just the gray sky weeping over Buckingham. He thought of Meghan, of the children, of California's sun. He thought of how, for the first time, he didn't feel royal, not even human. Just lost. And yet, behind him, the machinery of monarchy kept moving. Doors closing, lawyers whispering, orders being signed. The DNA test was already in motion, whether he agreed or not. As Harry left the palace grounds, an aide made a discreet call from the balcony. He's gone, the voice said. Proceed to phase 2. Phase 2. Even Harry didn't know there was a phase 2. He would soon. Because back inside, King Charles wasn't finished. He was standing over the same folder, pen in hand, issuing a directive to his private council. All royal assets tied to Prince Harry were to be reviewed, assessed, and, if necessary, reclaimed. It wasn't anger that drove him. It was fear. Fear that the truth, once confirmed, would leave him the monarch who raised another man's son. And while Charles wrestled with the implications, the palace corridors hummed again, aides whispering, phones ringing, quiet chaos hidden beneath royal composure. Harry's departure wasn't an escape. It was the beginning of exile. That night, as the jet lifted him back into the Atlantic darkness, he stared out at the stars and whispered to himself, "If this is the truth they want, then they'll regret ever finding it." Because sometimes the truth doesn't heal, it destroys. And the truth waiting for King Charles would not only destroy his peace, it would unravel the crown itself. But what came next? The secret file, the whispers of Diana's letters, and the rediscovered photograph would tear open wounds the monarchy had spent decades burying. And once the first secret surfaced, there would be no stopping the rest. Because one man in the palace basement had just opened a drawer marked Hewitt. And what he found inside would shatter everything. What if the person you've always called Dad suddenly demanded proof that you were really his child? What if the bloodline you'd carried your whole life, your very name, was suddenly treated like a question mark? That was the echo running through Harry's head as the plane glided over the Atlantic. He hadn't slept. He'd replayed the confrontation at Buckingham Palace 100 times, each version worse than the last. Sometimes Charles's voice came out angry, sometimes trembling, sometimes cold, but it always ended the same way, with that sealed envelope lying between them like a loaded weapon. He'd thought the worst was over when he left. He was wrong. 2 days later, the royal household made it clear that this wasn't optional. Harry received a letter, not an email, not a call, but an official document hand-delivered by a discreet courier in a gray suit who refused to meet his eyes. His Majesty's physician requires a formal DNA confirmation, it read. This is to be conducted under royal supervision within 7 days. Non-compliance will be noted. No signature from Charles, just the royal crest pressed into wax. Harry tossed the letter onto the kitchen counter and stared at it as if it might explode. Meghan read it twice before speaking. "They've already decided," she said flatly. "They don't want truth, they want ammunition." Her voice trembled with anger, but Harry barely heard her. He felt hollow. The man who once spoke about family, forgiveness, reconciliation, his father, was now sending royal doctors to swab his cheek like a suspect. "Do I even have a choice?" Harry murmured. Meghan's response was immediate. "Yes, you can refuse. Let them stew in their paranoia. You owe them nothing." But deep down, Harry knew that wasn't true. The moment he refused, it would confirm every suspicion. The tabloids would run wild. "Prince refuses DNA test. What is he hiding?" The headlines practically wrote themselves. He sat at the kitchen table, running a hand through his hair. "If I say no, I'm guilty. If I say yes, I'm humiliated." Meghan reached across the table. "Then you fight back your way. On your terms." But before he could decide, the story was already out. Within 48 hours, anonymous royal sources began leaking to the press. A whisper here, a rumor there, tiny fragments stitched into headlines. King Charles seeks clarity on lineage question. Private testing underway. Harry summoned amid bloodline concerns. It was chaos disguised as exclusive reporting. Harry's phone exploded with messages from friends, journalists, even distant relatives. Some offered sympathy. Others wanted statements. But what cut deepest were the quiet messages from people he thought were family. People who said nothing at all. Inside Buckingham Palace, things were no calmer. Advisors had warned Charles that once word leaked, there would be no turning back. But Charles, pale and restless, insisted that silence would only feed the storm. In private, he told Camilla, "If I let this fester, it will destroy the monarchy." Camilla tried to reason with him. "And if you prove what they're saying is true?" Charles paused, his hand tightening around his teacup. "Then I'll deal with it as a father should." But he wasn't acting like a father. He was acting like a king protecting his crown. Behind the scenes, royal physicians prepared the test logistics. It would be done discreetly, in a neutral facility. Charles wanted the results verified by both the royal lab and an independent source, proof that no one could accuse him of interference. Meanwhile, in California, Harry's anger was brewing. He hadn't agreed yet, but the palace behaved as if he already had. He decided to call Charles directly, one last attempt at reason. "Father," he began, "you're letting this go too far." "Too far." Charles's voice was quiet but sharp. "Do you have any idea what's at stake?" "My life," Harry snapped. "My family. My reputation. And mine," Charles countered. "And the institution that has survived for 1,000 years." Harry swallowed hard. You think a cotton swab will protect the monarchy? I think it will protect the truth, Charles said. Harry could hear the strain in his voice. The king wasn't calm. He was unraveling under the weight of secrets he couldn't control. Do you even realize what this looks like? Harry asked. You're ordering a test like I'm some kind of imposter. There was a pause. Then Charles said softly, sometimes even a crown can't silence doubt. The line went dead. The next morning, a black SUV arrived outside Harry's California home. A man stepped out, discreet, polite, carrying a small briefcase. He introduced himself as Dr. Hartwell from the Royal Medical Service, here under the King's directive. Meghan refused to let him inside. You can wait outside, she said sharply. This is our home, not the palace. Harry followed her out, jaw set. Let's get it over with. The doctor nodded solemnly. Within minutes, it was done. A simple swab, a sterile package, a signature. But it felt like a violation of everything Harry thought was sacred. When Dr. Hartwell left, Meghan closed the door behind him and whispered, They've won. You played their game. Harry shook his head. No. Now we'll see what they're afraid of. He wasn't wrong. Because thousands of miles away, in the royal archives beneath St. James's Palace, another set of samples had already been prepared, old, preserved, archived under Diana's name. King Charles had ordered a comparison against those records, too. Quietly, privately. But when the head of the lab opened the sealed files, something unexpected appeared, a folder labeled Hewitt. No one knew how it got there, or why it had been stored alongside royal genetic data, but its existence sent shockwaves through the palace staff. The folder contained a series of photographs, grainy, decades old, showing Diana and James Hewitt together during riding lessons. One image, taken secretly, showed a young Harry standing beside Hewitt, barely 4 years old, both with the same unmistakable red hair. The tabloids had joked about that photo years ago, calling it coincidence. But now, in the sterile light of the royal laboratory, it looked like evidence. Charles was briefed that evening. He said nothing at first, only stared at the folder before closing it quietly. Continue the process, he said at last. Back in California, Harry tried to move on. He took Archie to the park. He smiled for photographers. But inside, he was boiling. Every instinct told him that something bigger was happening behind the scenes. He wasn't wrong. 2 weeks after the sample was taken, a royal courier arrived at Buckingham Palace carrying a sealed envelope. Inside was a single-page report marked Confidential, Genetic Comparison. Charles read it alone in his study. Camilla waited outside, pacing. When he finally emerged, he looked as though the air had been drained from him. His face was colorless. Camilla rose. What does it say? Charles's voice was hoarse. It says, inconclusive. Inconclusive? He nodded slowly. There's enough similarity to raise doubt, but not enough to confirm. Camilla's brow furrowed. So it proves nothing. Charles's eyes were wet. It proves everything, he whispered. Because inconclusive meant that the one thing a monarch could never have, absolute certainty, was gone forever. Within hours, he summoned his advisors. From this moment, he said quietly, we proceed as if the matter may be true. That single sentence unleashed a domino of decisions, financial reviews, security downgrades, and a subtle order to the royal treasury, freeze assets linked to the Sussexes until further notice. Charles wasn't waiting for proof anymore. He was acting on fear, and as word trickled down the palace chain, not everyone agreed. Some aides were horrified. Others saw it as necessary damage control. But one man, a former private secretary, said something chilling during the meeting. If His Majesty believes the bloodline is in question, then the property is not merely a gift, it's contraband. The room fell silent. Meanwhile, Harry remained in the dark. No calls, no updates, no explanation. The palace stonewalled every inquiry. He tried contacting the king again. Nothing. Then, late one night, Meghan handed him her phone. Look, she said. There it was, a headline splashed across an online paper. King Charles orders private DNA investigation into Prince Harry. Final proof required. Harry felt his stomach drop. The words were almost identical to the letter he'd received. That's not a leak, he said quietly. That's a statement. He didn't know it yet, but his next trip to London would no longer be about family. It would be about defense. Because the monarchy wasn't waiting for truth anymore. It was preparing for separation. And as the king's lawyers drafted letters and the palace accountants combed through trust documents, one small detail buried in the genetic report caught the attention of a royal clerk. It wasn't about Harry. It was about Diana. The report showed a previously unidentified genetic variation, a marker that didn't match Charles or his lineage but traced back to another known sample in the archives. The name attached to it was unmistakable: James Hewitt. The clerk hesitated before forwarding the data, but orders were orders. By dawn, the king knew. He didn't speak for hours. He didn't eat. He simply sat in silence, the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. When Camilla entered later, he was holding the letter again, reading it over and over as though repetition might change the words. She whispered, "What will you do?" Charles looked up slowly. "What I must." And with that, he picked up the phone. Within hours, official notices were drafted, sealed, and dispatched to royal estates and financial departments. The order was clear: review, reclaim, and restrict all holdings connected to Prince Henry Charles Albert David. The monarchy was preparing to erase its own son. But the fallout from that decision, the missing letter from Diana, the retired staffer's confession, and the explosive photograph that would soon surface, had only just begun to unravel. And what came next would force King Charles to confront a truth even darker than the DNA results themselves. Because sometimes, the lie isn't in the blood, it's in the legacy. And that legacy was about to explode. What if the answers you feared most were already hidden in the walls around you? What if the palace, that magnificent fortress of marble and gold, wasn't just a home but a vault, filled with secrets that could destroy kings? That's what it felt like inside Buckingham in the days that followed the DNA test. The corridors weren't just quiet, they were listening. Servants whispered in corners, messages were passed in coded language, and eyes darted away whenever Charles appeared. Something in the palace air had changed, and everyone felt it. King Charles had ordered silence. No mention of the test, no acknowledgement of the results, no leaks under any circumstances. And yet, rumors moved faster than any decree. They seeped through staff, aides, and journalists like smoke through keyholes. The royal staff were trained never to ask questions, but curiosity was contagious. The DNA envelope had passed through too many hands, too many eyes, before reaching the king. People had seen the label, subject, HRH Prince Henry, and the second line, comparative analysis, subject JH, had sparked the wildfire. JH James Hewitt. To those who worked inside the palace, the initials weren't just familiar, they were taboo. The very name had been unofficially banned in conversation for decades. Anyone caught referencing the red-haired cavalry officer in Diana's past could expect immediate dismissal. Yet now, that same forbidden name was back in circulation, murmured under breath in the royal kitchens and private corridors. It started with the cleaning staff. Then it reached the footmen. Then the secretaries. By the end of the week, the entire palace knew, or thought they knew, that the king had demanded proof that Prince Harry was truly his son. But what they didn't know was that this wasn't the first time. In a locked chamber deep within the palace archives, behind stacks of sealed boxes marked crown property, there was an older file, a dusty one, dated 1995. It had been buried under personal affairs. The title read, Private Inquiry, Lineage Discrepancy. Only 3 people had seen that file: the late Queen Elizabeth, her private secretary, and the man who compiled it, Sir Geoffrey Wallace, one of the royal family's most discreet investigators. Wallace had been charged to quietly assess the origins of a persistent public rumor. In other words, to find out if young Prince Harry truly carried royal blood. The results of that secret inquiry had never been made public. The file was sealed by the Queen herself under a 75-year confidentiality clause. Wallace retired the following year, and not a single word of it reached the press. Until now. Because when Charles ordered a new DNA verification, the request inadvertently reopened the old file. The system flagged it as a duplicate subject. And that was when the archives clerk, confused by the cross-reference, pulled the 1995 dossier for verification. The moment she read the name James Hewitt, she froze. The photographs inside told their own story. Diana in riding gear, her laughter frozen in black and white. Hewitt at her side with the same careless smile. And there, in one photo, was a toddler with wide blue eyes and a mop of bright copper hair. The resemblance was haunting. The clerk hesitated. Then, trembling, she called her superior. "Sir, I think we have something that wasn't meant to be seen again." Within an hour, the file was removed from archives and sent directly to the king's private secretary. And that's when things began to unravel. Charles's secretary, Sir Alastair Pembridge, was no fool. He'd been with the royal household long enough to know when a secret was dangerous and when it was fatal. He requested a private audience with the king. "Your Majesty," Pembridge began carefully, placing the file on the desk. This was flagged during the recent verification. Charles glanced at the folder, expression unreadable, and Pembridge hesitated. "It's the original investigation from Her late Majesty's reign." Charles's hand stopped mid-motion. "I was told that file was sealed indefinitely." "It was," Pembridge said softly, "until your request reopened it." For a long moment, Charles said nothing. Then, with a sigh that sounded like defeat, he opened the folder. The first page was an internal memo dated October 1995. The handwriting was unmistakably the Queen's. "Proceed quietly. No public disturbance. If negative, burn. If positive, lock." Charles turned the page and found Wallace's final note. "Physical resemblance is statistically significant. Timing of relationship with Captain Hewitt coincides with possible conception period. Official verification impossible without medical consent." Charles shut the folder and pressed his hands to his eyes. It wasn't confirmation, but it wasn't denial either. It was something worse, a possibility. Outside the king's study, the palace machinery kept running. Luncheons, ceremonies, speeches, all continued on schedule, a royal illusion of normalcy. But inside, paranoia spread. Certain staff were reassigned. Phones were monitored. And somewhere, an anonymous email appeared in the inbox of a senior journalist at the Daily Sentinel. The king's son may not be his son at all. No attachments. No sender traceable. Just those words. Meanwhile, Harry had no idea that the palace was sitting on a secret decades old. All he knew was that silence from London meant something had gone wrong. Days turned into weeks. No calls from Charles. No updates from the lab. Not even a courtesy response to his lawyers. Then one night, Meghan found him on the patio staring out at the California hills. "They're not going to tell you anything," she said. "You know that." Harry exhaled slowly. "They will. Eventually. The monarchy doesn't do uncertainty, it picks a side." He was right. The monarchy had picked one. It just hadn't told him which. Because while Harry waited for closure, the king was making moves that would soon reach across oceans. In a meeting at Clarence House, Charles addressed his legal counsel and property manager. "Until verification is complete," he said, "I want all assets connected to the Duchy of Cornwall reevaluated. No transfers. No renewals. Nothing in Henry's name until further notice." It was bureaucratic language for something deeply personal. That same night, a memo went out to estate managers at Frogmore Cottage, Highgrove, and the Sussex-linked properties. It was labeled Property Review Directive. The wording was sterile, but the meaning was brutal. Harry's homes and holdings were now under investigation. Even within palace walls, the tone was shifting. Servants who once spoke fondly of the young prince now used formal titles. Conversations about the Sussexes became colder, mechanical, as though speaking about strangers. Then came the whisper that broke through the walls of protocol. A whisper from one of the oldest palace employees, a retired butler who had served both Diana and Charles. His name was Edward Barrington. He'd been there during Diana's darkest days. He'd seen the tears, heard the arguments, witnessed the fragile moments when she'd confide in her staff because there was no one else to trust. When a reporter approached him under the guise of a royal legacy piece, Barrington hesitated. But then he said something that would echo across every newsroom in Britain. "The truth," he said softly, "has been locked in those walls for too long. And I think Diana wanted it to come out." He didn't give details, just a hint, enough to feed speculation. But behind that vague confession was something real. Barrington had kept a diary, one Diana had asked him to hide. That diary, long forgotten, was still in his possession. In it were entries from 1984, the year Harry was born. One line stood out. "Charles and I argued again. He says the boy looks nothing like him. I told him love isn't measured in mirrors." Barrington never showed that page to anyone. Until now, when a journalist from the Sentinel met him privately, he handed over photocopies of several pages. Within hours, Excerpts hit the editor's desk. The next morning, the headline ran across social media before dawn. Diana's former butler breaks silence. Claims king once doubted Harry's paternity during marriage. The palace scrambled for damage control, but denial only fanned the flames. Every news outlet began re-examining old footage, old interviews, old photos. Comparison charts flooded Twitter. Harry and Hewitt, the uncanny resemblance. It wasn't just gossip anymore, it was investigation. Inside the palace, Charles's temper finally cracked. "How did this get out?" he demanded, slamming the newspaper onto his desk. His aides exchanged nervous glances. No one dared answer. Camilla placed a hand on his arm. "You can't silence ghosts," she said quietly. Charles glared at her, eyes sharp. "Then we bury them deeper." But it was too late. The story had escaped the walls. And somewhere, miles away, Harry read the article with trembling hands. He wasn't angry at the press. He wasn't even angry at Barrington. He was angry because a part of him, small but undeniable, had always wondered the same thing. What if it was true? What if he really wasn't Charles's son? That night, he sat alone with an old photo of his mother. "You'd tell me the truth, wouldn't you?" he whispered. "You wouldn't let them use me like this." The only answer was silence. But the silence wouldn't last. Because deep beneath the palace archives, another secret was about to surface. One that Diana herself had left behind, hidden inside a sealed envelope marked to be opened only by my son. And the person who found it wasn't supposed to. Because when an archivist dusted off a stack of old files one early morning, that envelope slipped out, and with it, the final words of a mother who may have known the truth all along. But before anyone could read it, that envelope vanished. And the person who took it worked directly for King Charles. The walls of Buckingham had kept many secrets, but this one would burn them down. Imagine being the man who knew the truth before anyone dared to whisper it. Imagine carrying that truth for 40 years, through the reign of a queen, through scandal after scandal, through weddings and funerals, while everyone else pretended the secret didn't exist. That was Edward Barrington's burden. He wasn't born royal. He was a servant, the kind who blended into wallpaper and heard everything. For decades, he'd served tea to queens, poured brandy for kings, and quietly polished silverware while the monarchy fractured in front of his eyes. And through it all, he'd kept his silence. Until now. Because after that newspaper headline broke, Diana's butler claims King doubted Harry's paternity. The world wanted to know more. Who was Edward Barrington? What did he know? Why speak now? The truth was simple: guilt. He'd promised Diana once, during one of her lonely nights in Kensington Palace, that he would keep her confidences until the right time. And now, as the monarchy was being shaken from the inside by a DNA test no one could contain, Barrington believed that time had finally come. He agreed to one interview. One only. Recorded late at night in a dim London apartment that smelled faintly of old books and whiskey. The journalist set the microphone down. "Mr. Barrington," he began gently, "why break your silence now?" Barrington's voice was gravelly, quiet. "Because I think she'd want her son to know what really happened." The interviewer leaned forward. "You mean Prince Harry?" Barrington nodded. "Yes. Harry deserves to know who his mother really was, not who they made her out to be." He paused, taking a long sip from his glass before continuing. "People forget, she was trapped. The marriage was already dead by the time Harry came along. Charles was distant, cold, always somewhere else. She used to cry at night, not for herself, but for the boys. She said, 'I'm raising them alone, even when he's in the next room.'" The journalist shifted. "Did she ever mention James Hewitt?" Barrington gave a small, sad smile. "They all want to know that." "Yes, she did. Not the way people think. He was kind to her. Too kind, perhaps. But their friendship started long after Harry's birth. I know because I was there when she first met him. Harry was nearly 2. He sighed deeply. But the resemblance, it haunted her. She knew what the world would say. She used to joke, "They'll make a scandal out of my freckles next." But deep down, she was afraid. Not because of the gossip, but because she knew Charles believed it. The journalist's eyes widened. King Charles questioned it himself. Barrington nodded slowly. "Oh yes. I'll never forget that night. It was winter, 1984. Harry was just a few months old. They'd been arguing all week about everything. The press, the trips, the coldness between them. Then one night, she came to the kitchen at midnight, still in her robe. She was shaking. I asked what was wrong, and she said, "He looked at the baby tonight and said, 'He doesn't look like me.'" The old butler's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. That broke her. Not the cheating, not the rumors, that. Because it wasn't just an insult. It was doubt. It was rejection of the one pure thing she thought she had left. The journalist sat in stunned silence. Barrington continued. She went to bed that night and didn't speak to him for 3 days. After that, something changed. She became more guarded. She kept a diary. "I know because she made me promise to hide it," she said. "One day, when Harry's old enough, he'll need to understand why his father couldn't love him the same way." The words hung in the air like smoke. "Do you still have the diary?" the journalist asked quietly. Barrington hesitated. "Not exactly. I don't have the diary itself, but I made copies of some pages. The originals, they disappeared after she died." "Disappeared?" He nodded. After the crash, palace officials swept through her private rooms. They took everything: letters, tapes, photographs. But they missed a few things. I made sure of that. He reached into a folder beside him and pulled out a thin stack of photocopies. The paper was yellowed with age. "These are hers," he said softly. The journalist stared at the words. One line stood out, dated 1986. "Sometimes I wonder if he looks at Harry and sees punishment instead of love. Perhaps that's why he keeps him at arm's length." Another line, from 1989. "The boys will grow up with the world watching them, but I fear it's Harry who'll bear the cruelty. He has my heart, but not their acceptance." The interviewer looked up. "Do you think she meant?" Barrington cut him off gently. "I think she meant the crown never forgives what it cannot control." The next day, excerpts from that interview leaked. Not all of it, just enough to ignite outrage. Diana's butler confirms royal rift began with Harry's birth. Charles accused of questioning paternity from day one. Hidden diary pages revealed Diana's heartbreak. The palace went into crisis mode. Official spokesmen called the claims fiction. Lawyers threatened injunctions. But the damage was done. Behind the walls of Buckingham, Charles was livid. "He's exploiting her memory," he shouted during a private meeting. "How dare he speak for her?" Camilla, watching quietly, finally spoke. "Perhaps he's not speaking for her," she said. "Perhaps he's speaking for the one she left behind." Charles froze. He knew exactly what she meant. That evening, he called his private secretary. "Find Barrington," he ordered, "and find out who gave him those pages." But it was too late. Barrington had already gone into hiding. The journalist who'd interviewed him had vanished from London, reportedly flying to France with the copies. The monarchy's grip on its secrets was slipping, and everyone knew it. Meanwhile, Harry sat thousands of miles away, scrolling through the news feed on his phone, reading his mother's words for the first time. He read them over and over, every line cutting deeper. Perhaps that's why he keeps him at arm's length. He finally understood what that meant. The coldness, the absence, the distance that followed him from childhood into adulthood. The reason his father could never quite look him in the eye. He turned to Meghan. "She knew," he said softly. "She knew this would happen." Meghan placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then maybe now it's time to fight back." Harry looked at her, his eyes hollow but determined. "No," he said. "It's time to finish what she started." Back in London, the Royal Press Office drafted a statement denying Barrington's claims. But before they could release it, another blow landed, a leaked audio clip. It surfaced online anonymously, Barrington's interview, unedited. In it, he said something that hadn't been printed. Something devastating. "She once told me," he said in the recording, "if anything ever happens to me, promise me Harry gets the letter. The one in the palace safe. It has the truth." The letter. Within hours, the internet exploded. What letter? Did Diana leave a message for Harry? Hashtags trended worldwide. Theories flooded Reddit. Some said it was a farewell note. Others claimed it contained names, proof, instructions. But the most chilling part wasn't the letter itself. It was that Barrington mentioned it was hidden in the palace safe. Because there was only one safe Diana had ever used, and it wasn't in her apartments. It was in the royal archives, under the king's control. By dawn, the phrase "Diana's lost letter" was everywhere. Charles's fury was volcanic. "That man will ruin what's left of this family," he snapped, pacing his study. But one aide, braver than most, asked the question no one else dared. "Sir, is there truly such a letter?" Charles froze. His silence was the answer. He dismissed the staffer immediately. But that same aide didn't leave quietly. Before the end of the day, he reached out to a journalist friend and said the words that made the monarchy's blood run cold. Yes, the letter is real. He claimed he'd seen it once, years ago, during an archival transfer after Diana's death. A white envelope with her handwriting, addressed simply, "To my son." He said he remembered the royal archivist sealing it in a folder marked restricted, personal correspondence of Diana, Princess of Wales. But that folder was never seen again. And when the aide was asked what happened to it, he said only, "Ask His Majesty." The next morning, that same aide was escorted from the palace. Official reason, breach of confidentiality. Unofficial reason, knowing too much. But his removal didn't stop the speculation, it amplified it. People began to wonder aloud. What was in that letter? Did Diana leave behind the truth about Harry's birth? Did she name the man she believed to be his father? Or did she confess something even deeper, something that could bring down the crown? One thing was certain. Whatever was in that envelope, King Charles didn't want it read. And somewhere in the bowels of the palace, behind a locked steel door, that letter waited, untouched, unseen, and ticking like a time bomb. Because once someone opened it, everything the royal family had built on duty and deception would come crashing down. And the man who had hidden it all those years, Edward Barrington, was about to make his final move. Because what he did next would ignite the most dangerous scandal the monarchy had ever faced. And no one, not even the king himself, could stop it. What if the truth about a royal family wasn't guarded by blood, but by intelligence agencies? What if the most powerful institution in Britain wasn't the monarchy, but the one tasked with protecting it? That's where the story turned next. Because as Edward Barrington's revelations tore through the tabloids and fueled every broadcast from London to Los Angeles, something far more secretive began to stir behind closed doors, something even Harry couldn't have imagined. MI5 had entered the picture. Officially, the British Security Service never interferes in royal domestic matters. Unofficially, it has always had one silent responsibility: to protect the continuity of the crown at all costs. Not the individuals who wear it, but the idea itself. And when that idea is threatened, especially by something as explosive as a DNA scandal, it becomes a matter of national security. 2 days after the leak of Barrington's audio, a private meeting was convened at an unmarked building near Millbank. Inside were 3 men: the King's private secretary, the Home Secretary, and an MI5 liaison officer known only as Director C. The mood was grim. Director C began without pleasantries. "Your Majesty's family situation is beginning to attract foreign attention," he said. "We've intercepted communications referencing Project Red, a term being used by international outlets to describe the paternity issue. This is no longer a domestic problem." The King's secretary leaned forward. "Are you saying hostile states are watching this?" C nodded. "They're already exploiting it. Disinformation campaigns have started online suggesting that the royal bloodline is fraudulent. Russian, American, and Middle Eastern networks are all amplifying it." The Home Secretary's voice was tight. "And what are you recommending?" C looked him dead in the eye. "Control. Containment. And if necessary, redaction." "Redaction?" the Secretary repeated. "Yes," C said calmly. "If there are files, letters, or recordings that could compromise royal legitimacy, they must be secured immediately, permanently." That's how the secret order began, the one that would later be called the Hewitt Containment Directive. Overnight, MI5 agents quietly entered royal properties under the guise of security upgrades. Hard drives were copied, safes were cataloged, archive boxes were transported to undisclosed locations for digital preservation. In truth, they weren't preserving anything, they were erasing it. At least, that was the plan. But one document escaped. Because deep inside the royal archives, under restricted access, lay a folder labeled Hewitt, Supplementary Material 1989 to 1996. It wasn't supposed to exist, but it did, and MI5 found it. When agents opened it, they discovered something shocking: a confidential report filed by an intelligence officer who had once been assigned to Princess Diana's security detail. The officer's name was Richard Havers, and what he'd written decades earlier now read like prophecy. The report described how, in 1985, certain senior courtiers had requested unofficial monitoring of Diana's social circle due to emotional instability and potential for embarrassment to the monarchy. Translation: the palace had her followed. Every call, every meeting, every conversation she had outside official engagements was logged in secret. And in one of those reports, dated late 1985, Havers noted a name: Captain James Hewitt. At the time, the entry meant little. But when MI5 reviewed the file in the present day, something else stood out: a handwritten addendum in red ink. Subject: exhibits prolonged contact pattern consistent with emotional reliance. Recommend ongoing observation. Note: correlation with timeline of second pregnancy inconclusive. It was the word inconclusive that froze the room. The king's secretary demanded immediate clarification. Are you saying the intelligence service was monitoring the princess's personal life during her pregnancy? Director C's response was simple: yes, and we have the evidence. That's when the real panic began. Because the file didn't just implicate Diana, it implicated the entire royal apparatus. MI5 hadn't acted alone. The surveillance had been authorized by the late Queen's chief of staff and discreetly reported to Prince Charles at the time. In other words, Charles had known. He had known about the rumors from the very beginning. And now, those reports, those pages, were sitting in front of him again, decades later, staring back like ghosts he thought he'd buried. When Charles was shown the documents in private, he didn't speak for several minutes. He simply stared at the paragraphs written in fading ink, his hands trembling slightly. Why wasn't this destroyed? He asked finally. Director C's answer was cold. Because destruction leaves questions. Storage leaves deniability. Charles exhaled heavily, sinking into his chair. And what about my son? C paused. That depends on what you want to do, Your Majesty. Camilla, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke softly. You already know what he'll do. He'll go public. She was right. The public was now hungry for anything: letters, tapes, DNA, testimonies. Every tabloid editor in the country smelled blood. Meanwhile, Harry was preparing his own response. He had begun reaching out to lawyers, exploring whether he could legally compel access to any personal documents of his late mother held by the crown. The move terrified the palace, because if Harry demanded access, the Hewitt file could fall into his hands. Inside the palace, a private crisis meeting was called. Present were the king, Camilla, Director C, and the royal solicitor. The solicitor spoke bluntly. If Prince Harry files a legal claim, we'll be forced to disclose at least some of the archival inventory. That could include restricted files. Charles's face darkened. Then make sure he doesn't. How? The solicitor asked. Director C leaned forward. By preempting him. And that's how Operation Nightfall began. Its goal was simple: ensure that every piece of material linking Diana, Hewitt, or any intelligence report suggesting paternity doubts was secured, redacted, or quietly reclassified under the Official Secrets Act. The king agreed immediately. Do it, he said. Within 48 hours, MI5 agents infiltrated storage facilities across London. Trucks moved at midnight. Records disappeared. Witnesses were silenced with confidentiality agreements. But not everything could be erased, because one of the officers assigned to the operation, an archivist named Claire Havers, the daughter of Richard Havers, the very man who wrote the 1985 report, recognized her father's handwriting on the pages she was ordered to destroy. She hesitated. She read the lines again and again. Then she did something no one expected. She scanned them. She made a digital copy. And she hid it. Her reason was simple. If the monarchy can erase truth, she told a colleague, then it never deserved to survive it. Meanwhile, Harry's request for access to his mother's personal letters was formally denied. The reason? National security and privacy concerns. It was the first time anyone had used the term national security in reference to a mother's handwritten notes. Harry was furious. They're her letters, he shouted to his lawyer. Her words. What possible threat could they pose? His lawyer hesitated. Apparently, one big enough for MI5. And that's when Harry realized something even darker. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was a government-level cover-up. Across the Atlantic, journalists began connecting dots. Former intelligence officers hinted on background that there had been concerns about Diana's communications during the 1980s. Some even claimed she'd been considered a potential vulnerability due to her relationships with non-royal associates. It was all carefully phrased. No one said the forbidden name outright, but everyone knew what they were implying. In the shadows of Westminster, whispers grew louder. The monarchy's bloodline question isn't about gossip. It's about national stability. Inside Buckingham Palace, Charles's health began to visibly decline. Sleepless nights, trembling hands, exhaustion. He'd told himself he was protecting the crown. But deep down, he feared he was protecting something far smaller, his own pride. Camilla found him one morning in his study, staring at a stack of shredded documents. "Do you think she'd forgive you?" she asked quietly. Charles didn't answer. "Do you think he will?" she pressed. He finally looked up. "No," he said softly. And maybe he shouldn't. That same day, Director C briefed him one last time. "Your Majesty, the physical files are gone. But there's one loose end." Charles's voice was hoarse. "What loose end?" "The archivist," C said. "She made a copy." Charles's heart sank. "Does she still have it?" "We don't know. But she's left her post. She's disappeared."